Hi there. This video is my initial reactions to Fire and Blood. Now, a highlight of this video is there are points in Fire and Blood where I think that George R.R. Martin was criticizing the Game of Thrones TV show. Two big points, and I'll go over those. Fire and Blood Volume 1 by George R.R. Martin, full of prequel outlines, came out just in time for Thanksgiving in the United States on November 20th, and the fandom is now very busy going over it. You're seeing this rebirth in activity in book fan sites like the forums and Westeros.org going over all the material, though there's a moratorium on wiki updates for it on Westeros.org's Wiki of Ice and Fire until December 20th. That they want people to actually go out and buy it, not just read up the Jaehaerys article on their wiki. They said, this is what happened when the other prequel novellas came out. They said there's a moratorium on updating it until around Christmas. So look forward to that too, that everyone on the forums is making lists of things we need to update wiki articles with. This is also an update video for my YouTube channel in general, guys. Sorry for all my subscribers. I realize I haven't updated here in about a month. So I wanted to give everyone an explanation and a heads up to check back for major updates soon, that I have recorded a lot of new videos that are going to be coming out. Check back pretty frequently. What happened was I was racing to finish a lot of prequel videos in time for Fire and Blood's release, but I was behind schedule due to work and family, plus the Thanksgiving holiday. And then I realized, why am I racing to get this done by November 20th? Everyone else is going to be reading Fire and Blood too. I realized I can't work on videos. I'll be reading Fire and Blood to get all the stuff online as quickly as possible. Everyone else will be reading Fire and Blood. They're not going to be watching videos for a week or two. So I might as well read it along with them in case there's any relevant new info in them. So just by late November, I realized might as well switch to Fire and Blood and put the videos on hold. So guys, it's this huge new prequel collection. I should have been reading that. Now, on top of that, I move slowly through the book because I take notes. I don't skim just to see who dies, but methodically exhaust every page of info. Remember, like back in after Season 1, when Book 5, A Dance with Dragons, came out, there were people who just skimmed through it really quickly to see who lives and dies, and then said, I read it. You're skimming it for spoilers. You aren't reading, because Martin is that kind of writer who will drop hints about future things, or retroactive. It's not just, English major, I'm picking this apart for theories. I mean, real substantive information that you should have been paying attention to because they were added in subtly. It's this giant 1,000-page book. You shouldn't skim it for, and here's another red wedding. You are casual fans, and you aren't watching this as a story. That isn't, and it's not, the beauty of his language is he drops hints about things, mystery elements that you need to pay attention to. So, you see here, I go through taking handwritten notes, page this, they say this about Tyrosh, page this, they talk about Rhaenyra, new information, it'll be going into wikis and stuff. That way, I only need to read it once, because I'm going through slowly and methodically. The phrase I use is exhausting every page of all plausible information, which is kind of what I do when I update TV episode stuff. When a new TV episode comes out, I rewatch it, pausing constantly, writing down anything that, wait a minute, this is something that'll go in the wiki, proper name that's referenced we should update. So I didn't just skim the damn thing, because a lot of this, the outline of this, we already knew from the World of Ice and Fire. The whole point is it's a more detailed version of that. So I've been a month behind because I was working on other videos. It's like right before I was about to post them and they were finished, I realized no one's going to watch this now that Fire and Blood's out. So I'm sitting on a lot of videos, combined to the fact that then I was working on Fire and Blood stuff. That's why I'm so far behind. But good news is there's a backlog of stuff to look forward to over Christmas break. Moving along, I'm still upset, though not really surprised, at people who dismissed Fire and Blood, barely knew what it was until the moment they opened it, and complained it wasn't the Winds of Winter, and then we're confused that it's a fake history book rather than a narrative story. Martin's been talking about this for years. Pay attention. Just all fan site leaders on all sides, complaining on Twitter and everything. Why are people freaking out that this isn't Winds of Winter and blaming it for that? This is old material that's being repackaged. Let me explain. Martin went on Colbert just the other day, and it was a really nice interview. If you haven't seen it, watch it online. It's just surprising. Wow, this is the first half. It's 700 pages long. How is there this much material? Well, Martin compared it to how Tolkien's Lord of the Rings has the Silmarillion, which is a deep lore prequel outline. And Colbert, by the way, is a huge Tolkien fan, knows the Silmarillion inside and out, so, great minds thinking alike. All he had to say to Colbert was, well, it's like my Silmarillion. He went, oh, he instantly got it. He's from a long line of it-getters. It's the deep lore backstory outline stuff. He understood it. It's a backstory thing. On top of that, well, why should we be hyped about this? Martin has publicly said at least 2, I don't know what he means by at least, like could some borrow elements from it, but at least 2 of the 5 prequel TV series pitches made to HBO are directly based on material in Fire and Blood. It is a preview of those. It's not, who would want this? Martin releases prequel TV series outline is a pretty good headline. Why aren't people paying attention to that? That's why I'm interested in it. Almost assuredly, these 2 are the Targaryen Conquest and the Dance of the Dragons. And he said one of the reasons he's putting it out now was his publishers pressured him that you should get this book version out before a TV series comes out that might be based on it. So you can't really judge this as a book. It's weird seeing book reviews of it by professional book review websites. It's not a traditional book, as in a novel. It's a history book and a collection of prequel outlines. Good and bad don't enter into it as like the reading experience of a novel. It's not like that. It doesn't have a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end of characters. Like some characters are born, live, then die of old age, because it covers 150 years. But it's not structured like that. So when I'm saying my initial reactions, my only real personal evaluation was being happy at how much or how little detail we got. How much new information, the more the better. For world building, and for, this would be an idea for a prequel, because I already like these prequel eras, like the Targaryen Conquest and the Dance of the Dragons, I already think would be good TV shows, and this is rounding it out more and more info to go on. So I'm evaluating it based on how much more did we learn. Well, for people complaining about that, why is he spending so much time on this? Most of this is history backstory that Martin already wrote, back around like 2012. For the eventual release of The World of Ice and Fire in-universe source book in 2014. And he said it just flowed out of him really easily, because ideas have been rattling around him for a while, just never set pen to paper. And he remarked on how much more simple it is than the Winds of Winter. Winds of Winter, you have to get in the characters' heads and their personality, and there's a dozen character narratives, all of whom are POVs. There isn't just one main character. And he said, Fire and Blood's mostly outlines. It is easier to write than a narrative novel. But he wrote this all back maybe season 1 or 2-ish when 2012, they were preparing for the World book, which came out in 2014. And this was all just sitting on his shelf, a lot of it. The first half or so, he said he wrote through the first half of Targaryen history, 300-year history. Volume 1 covers the first 150 years. And he realized, this would never fit in the World book. I should stop. But, it was just sitting on a shelf collecting dust. He wanted fans to have some preview of that. So he released samples of them as 3 novellas in multi-author anthology collections. The first was The Princess and the Queen, which was about the Dance of the Dragons. And that was amazing, because that came out a year before the World book. It's just this whole vast new prequel era we had no idea about. We knew very little about the Dance of the Dragons before that. Like on the scale of the Dunk and Egg prequels, it's just all of these new characters and names. flooding out at us because it was just a sample taken out of a longer series of novellas. Because it wasn't the first one. There were setup ones. Like, year after that, we got The Rogue Prince, which is the chapter right before that, as a prelude setting up, well, this is how these factions came in conflict with each other. It's shorter. And then just last year, we got The Sons of the Dragon, which is about Maegor the Cruel and the Faith Militant Uprising. So there are already these 3 big novellas. And the World Book just contains short glosses of all of this, that they couldn't fit it in, briefly summarizing in a single page how the Dance of the Dragons ended. But at the time, they told it was tantalizing, is what I'm trying to say, that Princess and the Queen was 30,000 words long, the print version, and they openly said, him and his publishers, well, the unpublished Dance of the Dragons is 60,000 words worth of material, that if you liked Princess and the Queen, you're like, there's twice this much material, and you're not releasing it to us. And not just he hadn't written it, it exists, and you're just not releasing it. Because who knows, well, maybe we'll release it when the book series is over. Who knows how long that could take. The World Book reduced these to just glosses, though for the Targaryen conquest, it does contain the full 10,000 word text of that, so that's like the 4th novella. That one was the shortest and was most important, so he put it right in there. So you already knew that one, about the conquest, creation, the Iron Throne. So putting them in chronological order, you roughly get Targaryen conquest, including material sprinkled around in the World Book, in the Dorne chapter and Aegon's conquest, from about 2 years before the conquest to 37 years after conquest. Direct sequel to that is The Sons of the Dragon, that younger characters in the conquest, like Visenya, live to be older grandparents in the Sons of the Dragon era. That if this was a TV show, I actually think they'd make one big combined show. That's why I've circled them here. That goes from year 37 to 48. And then came the long and peaceful 55-year reign of Jaehaerys the Conciliator, ending in 101 AC. So Martin just said he skipped over this and didn't write anything for it for the World Book. There was no hidden chapter they didn't release. The World Book author said the 3,000 words we got on this that are in the World Book are all that exists. We aren't sitting on notes that he didn't give us. He really glossed over it. He didn't round this out because not much happens. It's peace. Then you get the combined Dance of the Dragons and Regency era, starting with the Rogue Prince, which is the setup for that. It's from Jaehaerys' death to the dance itself, 129, 131, and then the 6-year-long Regency era that followed, which is, they said, it's almost as much material as the dance itself, 60,000 words, and all these wars going on in there. Now, as I've said before, the one metric we have to go on of how many books or TV seasons could this material sustain, these outlines, is that George R.R. Martin said that The Sons of the Dragon could sustain 3 books. Not a Song of Ice and Fire length doorstopper books, but like the size of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, a normal 300-page book or so. So if that could be 3 books, I could see a combined Conquest, Faith Militant Uprising show lasting 5 or 6 years. You think Season 1 is the Conquest, Season 2 is the First Dornish War, then 3 seasons, like a chapter break, a book per season of then Enos and the beginning of the Faith Militant Uprising would be Season 3, Season 4 would be the Rise of Maegor, and then Season 5 would be the Fall of Maegor. You can see how that breaks down. Now, Martin originally intended each chapter to be a sidebar in the World Book, and he only gradually realized they couldn't all fit into it. Thus, he got progressively bolder from chapter to chapter, moving more and more away from a short summary meant to fit into sidebars and getting more detailed. So, the Targaryen conquest is arguably more important than the Dance of the Dragons, but in text form it's a fairly curt 10,000 words with little dialogue. Because he was still in sidebar mode, you see. But The Princess and the Queen, if you've read them already, please talk about this in the comments, it's noticeably more expansive. There's more actual dialogue in it of saying, this character said this. And this trend continued into the Regency material. The more he was doing this, the more he actually treated it like a narrative novella. So Martin didn't spend the last 2 years writing this book, as some people are complaining. Most of it was already written for the World Book, 2012, 2014. He made a few refinements to these, but this was stuff that was sitting on a shelf. Unreleased material we were annoyed we might have to wait 10 years for it. Now, he did say last year that because there's that gap between the two eras, he was going to write new material for Jaehaerys I to round it out, a bridge section to link the two. And everyone thought, oh, like maybe 10,000 words like Rogue Prince or Conquest or something. He rounded it out. It now covers over a quarter of the finished 700-page book. I counted in the US edition, there are 230 pages on Jaehaerys rounding it out. What we originally thought would be a short linker chapter. So, introductions out of the way, how much new info did we get in Fire and Blood? Well, the whole thing more or less breaks down into 4 parts. I mean, by prequel era. There's internal chapters, but chunks of story. You've got the Targaryen conquest through Sons of the Dragon, that these were the ones where he was writing them shorter, even though there's a lot of material that's just summarized. And they're only about 100 pages long through the end of Sons of the Dragon, the death of Maegor. But it feels like a quarter because it's covering a lot of material. Then all the new Jaehaerys I material, and that gets you about to the middle of the book. Then expanded Dance of the Dragons. It's Rogue Prince plus Princess and the Queen plus the ending we never got, but they're drastically expanded and putting new stuff in new context. And then there's the Regency era under Aegon III, which we had nothing on this before, other than like a 1-page gloss in the World Book. So these are more or less the 4 different eras or generations. The characters in the Jaehaerys part don't really live into the dance. So many characters die in the dance that people who were minor child characters during the dance become major characters in the Regency and so forth. So more or less 4 quarters divided up this way. I'm not done going through it all. I got through the end of Jaehaerys I, and now I'm going through the dance and Regency stuff, again, slowly taking notes. Well, except for 1 or 2 fixed errors, the Targaryen conquest is what's in the World Book. Some people recommend even skipping it, but you need to remember who these characters are, unless you read it and leading up to publication. If you haven't read this in a year, you should reread it to know who everyone is in the Sons of the Dragon stuff. As we suspected, Peace of the Dragon through Aegon I's death turned out to be info we already had. That there was this one point where Elio, the World Book author, let it slip, there's this other novella titled The Peace of the Dragon, which, it's the lost prequel novella. No, it is entirely material we already had. It was a short chapter. It's scattered between the Aegon I chapter of the World Book and the Dorne thematic regional chapter of the World Book. Everything about the First Dornish War that we already learned in the World Book, that wasn't in the Conquest mini-chapter, that was all already World Book material. It does give a little more detailed description of the First Dornish War. It's not some huge other event we never heard about, just a little more about military tactics and that sort of thing, which is pleasant, but it's not a new chapter in its own right. It's stuff they moved around and scattered in their World Book, and then it's moved together coherently here. This is nothing substantial, not that I'm complaining. Then, starting with Sons of the Dragon, it starts adding a few paragraphs here and there that were cut from the novella version. We knew that. They said there's some parts we cut. And they're nice to have, and they're points we could tell were a little fuzzy before. Some of them were cut, some of them were new additions that were written in, like, well, you don't clearly explain how Prince Aegon got Quicksilver. That was added in to make it more clear. A few fixes, like, no, Vagar was burning castles in the Riverlands, not the Reach. Little fixes and a few lines that were cut out. Now, the biggest expansion is a lot of detail on Princess Rhaena. Most of the omitted paragraphs that are now restored were about her. And it really seems like if this was a book, she'd be a POV character, narrating her own chapters. If this was a TV show, she'd be one of the starring cast. And a lot of it was, I can see why they cut it, that it's set up for the Jaehaerys section. It's spill over backwards from the following Jaehaerys section, where she does a lot of stuff and has all these inheritance issues with her children, because technically she's older than Jaehaerys, and Aegon was older, the older brother, so her children with him, some people think, are the rightful heirs. They have all these issues with that. These are nice to have, but conceptually they're really like part of the Jaehaerys stuff that was chronologically slipped in a little earlier to set it up. Now, this is important because I'll refer to it more than once. The Jaehaerys section was written last. That the other stuff is stuff he wrote for the World Book, or fixed up a little. The Jaehaerys thing is something he wrote last year. It was written after the Dance and Regency sections, even though they chronologically come later in the book. So it continues that trend of the farther along he got, he realized this isn't going to be a sidebar in the World Book. The World Book's already been published by the time he was writing Jaehaerys. So it's the most expansive, with long sections of dialogue, verging on, even more than the Regency section, verging on book-like narrative. It ranks among the best writing Martin has ever done. And I don't just mean as, I'm some critic. I've seen people like Brendan Beefish, the moderator on Reddit's A Song of Ice and Fire subreddit, saying, and other fandom leaders going, this is one of the best pieces of writing he's ever done. Not in terms of how exciting it is, I'm talking writing, in terms of a character study, the subtlety of it. It's more of a small-scale character study following Jaehaerys and Alysanne across a scale of 50 years, and about diplomacy and about their relationship. People standing around a table talking versus giant wars. There aren't a lot of wars and action in it. It's not very photogenic. But in terms of just understanding these people as characters, it's really good and very subtle and enjoyable. The Jaehaerys material basically breaks down into two broad subsections, pretty evenly. Part 1 is dealing with the aftermath of Maegor and the Faith Militant Uprising, from about the year 48 to 62, and it ends with a harsh winter accompanied by the Shivers Plague, which is apparently worse than the Great Spring Sickness that happened in early Dunkinegg. That the Shivers Plague was like their Black Death. Book ended with the Third Dornish War, that the winter ends, Third Dornish War happens. They reveal that through the end of the Regency, there were 4 Dornish Wars. There was the first one we already knew about. The Vulture Hunt is officially counted as the Second Dornish War. And the third one, they said the first one was the worst one, that the third one was just a bandit chief that had been around since Maegor died. At the end of Sons of the Dragon, it says the Dornish are raiding in the mountains, that there was another Vulture King, and it took them like 14 years to deal with him just because they had so many internal problems after Maegor and the Faith Militant. He couldn't turn his attention to that. That and the fact he wasn't a very powerful Vulture King, that they said the real first Vulture King had armies in the thousands, eventually 30,000. This guy had a few hundred bandits, and it was really just hunting down a bandit chief. And like the Second War, it didn't formally involve the Martells and Dorne as a state fighting the Iron Throne. Then the Fourth Dornish War happened like 20 years later, in which the stupid, moronic Prince of Dorne decided to attack the Stormlands by sea, in revenge for the dishonor of the Targaryens taking out the other Vulture King, and they killed the Vulture King in the Third Dornish War, then left. It wasn't an invasion, yet you feel the need to avenge it. So they tried attacking by ship. It took them 6 months to prepare, so it wasn't a surprise attack. Everyone knew they were coming. Jaehaerys and his sons just attacked with the fleet with dragons. They didn't lose a single man. The Targaryens didn't lose a single person in the Fourth Dornish War. So I guess that would mean Daeron the First, the Young Dragon, he might have been the Fifth War, and Aegon the Unworthy's much maligned Wooden Dragons invasion might have been the Sixth. Though, for all we know, there was another invasion during the time of Aegon III to take advantage of the weakness from the Dance of the Dragons, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That Part 1, from the death of Maegor through the Plague Year, Winter, and Third Dornish War, it goes, each chapter is like 1 year or 2 or 3 years at a spurt, covering 14 years. then you can tell the style changes, that it starts skipping a lot of years. It just skips through the 60s. It stops going year by year anymore. So 62 to about 100 AC, when Alysanne dies of old age, it's skipping around a lot more and dealing with their relationships with their children as they grow up, and the various issues and problems they have with all of them. And the nice ones die, the bad ones meet short ends because they're just children, so it's interesting knowing what their children are like. And a lot of it is dealing with Rhaena, that a major new part in this material are the complications with Princess Rhaena and her twin daughters, Arya and Rhaella, that if you read Sons of the Dragon a year ago, we kept asking, what the hell happened to them? They were alive at the end of this? We assumed they'd be killed. That they could challenge the succession order, that arguably they're the rightful heirs. And yes, a lot of this is dealing with that. That early in his rule, surrounded by enemies, people considered using him as puppets against him. Rhaena, not specifically, that she felt bitter about it, but she'd been so traumatized by Maegor, she just wanted to be left alone and retire, that she didn't want to be part of the royal court anymore. So we'll have to pick apart for years what were her attitudes in this, that she didn't want her daughters used as puppets. Rhaena had a long but tragic life, that if you think, oh, she manages to live, but something bad always happens. And it's revealed she was gay, but it's this string of failed romantic relationships, but then, I don't understand this, her exes hang out at her castle anyway, dating her other exes, and there's still a social group, even though she moves on to dating another one. I don't know how that works, but there's like 4 or 5 of them at a time in her court, and they'll move on from one ex to the other one, and it was a string of failed romantic relationships. She never really settled with one person for more than, like, maybe 10 years at the most. But moving on to the Dance of the Dragon stuff, this is where things get interesting. It's a little discouraging reading through the Maegor stuff, that, okay, we knew this was mostly stuff we'd seen already. And the Jaehaerys stuff is interesting because it's new, entirely new, but even though not that much, like a giant war isn't happening. I was worried that the dance stuff would be like the Maegor stuff. It's not. That it is twice as long. And it's not just a paragraph here or a paragraph there, the way with the Maegor stuff, cut and paste. Like, you have to reread every paragraph, because they're not just the same paragraph from Princess and the Queen. And they're rewritten in such a way that it adds new context, that the editors cut a lot out of this and really chopped it up when they made Princess and the Queen. Plus revisions he might have made, that even the material we already got from Princess and the Queen is pervasively given small but significant expansions throughout. The unreliable narrator framing device is most heavily used here, if you've seen Princess and the Queen already, of, well, there's one pro-Aegon II historian and one pro-Rhaenyra historian, and depending on that, we've been yelling a lot about this, people didn't understand that when it goes, Aegon II didn't even want to be king, that now it includes like a page-long thing of the pro-him historian Eustace emphasizing this so much. I'm telling you, Eustace said he didn't want to be king, that this was propaganda, and the way it's framed now makes that clear. But it's not always so black and white. That some of them are, well, he plausibly could have done that, like Rashomon style, when you have different authors giving different opinions of the same event. Some of them are clearly propaganda, and some of them, well, maybe this counterbalances the other side's propaganda, because we will have fun debating for years what really happened. This has a lot of reread value, that this will sustain book fandom for not like 20 years, but like for a good 2 or 3 years. We are going to be examining this just as much as we did events in the A Song of Ice and Fire novels seen by multiple characters, where you're trying to get a real sense of what is Littlefinger up to, what is Cersei up to, and picking it apart. So this will sustain discussion for quite some time, and it's interesting that way. Then, I haven't gotten through that much of the Regency material, but it's interesting that it only covers the first 6 years of Aegon III's reign, but what a 6 years they were. The Regency era, that Westeros is in chaos, the dance ended in exhaustion, Fighting is still going on in many areas. The Lannisters are fighting their own side war with the Greyjoys, which was a campaign theater in the dance that just never ended, led by the Widow Lannister. There's broken men and bandits from the defeated armies going around all over the place. It's very dangerous. Starvation setting in because all the fields are burned out. Again, it's a lot more expansive because it was written later, though there aren't so much wars as politics and intrigue, a lot of assassinations. It's loosely comparable how I also said the Jaehaerys section is also not so much wars as characters. Well, Jaehaerys was a peaceful conciliator. They are not. A lot of thrilling intrigues and assassinations in this. This would make a good TV show storyline. The Jaehaerys stuff isn't as photogenic, but this, obviously wouldn't be war-scale stuff, but, assassins, intrigue, poisonings. This could make for a good court political drama. And there is violence and stuff now and again. You read it, this could be a TV show. I think that if they made a Conquest show, the later seasons would be Sons of the Dragon. I think if they made a Dance of the Dragons prequel, which they're probably going to, the Regency would be like season 5 or 6. This wouldn't be a standalone show. And even Westeros has said this would have to be a follow-up to a dance show, just the way that it's structured. It's like a direct sequel to it. You wouldn't know anyone is. So that's the overview. Now, because this is just my initial reactions, I'm just going to go down the list of interesting bits of info I found so far to share with you. These are interesting, cool things we found out in it for the rest of the video. Unfortunately, for readers of the sample novellas for these prequel eras if you already read these and already invested in it, we didn't learn anything new about dragon lineages or even dragon colors. We still don't know what color Vhagar was. After all this time, we still don't know the color of Vhagar, of the 3 dragons belonging to Rhaenyra's older sons, and of the 3 hatchling dragons, Morgul, Shrykos, and Stormcloud, during the dance. But Vhagar is the biggest one of all. One major exception, is that in the World Book it says Orenna of Pentos' dragon egg in the Vale eventually hatched, and she named it Morning. And that becomes a big problem, that by that point the Greens, Aegon II's faction, all their dragons are dead, and the Blacks have 1 dragon left, and it's a hatchling, it can't be ridden yet, but people start feeling, well, that makes them more legitimate. They have a dragon and you don't. So we find out that Morning was pale pink with black highlights as her secondary color. Like how Balerion is black with red highlights, she was pink with black highlights. Which, in that combination, I think would look kind of interesting, with black on pink. But the first big revelation here is, months ago, the jacket description for the book put out by the publishers promised it explains the real origins of Daenerys' dragon eggs. Now, Martin swiftly moved to deny it, and that, that's just them trying to hook customers, and there have been points in the past where publishers made up stuff on the jackets for his book that didn't turn out to have any basis in it. So that made complete sense to us, and we didn't take it any further of, it's just them doing their usual stuff of trying to hook people. Turns out, yes, it's real. The book explains the real origin of Daenerys' dragon eggs. It is the biggest connection between this collection of outlines, this book, and the main novels, if you're interested in Daenerys and her dragons. And I think Martin denied it because he wanted it to be a surprise for fans. And I can see why you want that, but I really side with his publishers on this, though. I can see that, this is one of the biggest links between this book and his main novel series. You want to play that up so people know to buy it. That in the main novels, they told her, they're from Ashai, where there are lots of fossilized dragon bones and dragon eggs from the Dawn Age. But they're not from Ashai. They were stolen from Dragonstone by the ex-lover of a Targaryen and then sold to the Sea Lord of Braavos. The thief didn't have a political agenda, they just needed money, so they stole 3 dragon eggs. And that means that they're not just, I always felt it was kind of something lacking, that they're not really Targaryen dragons, they're from Ashai. No, they are part of the Targaryen dragon lineage. which ties them in with all the prequel stuff of the prequel dragons a lot more, like Balerion, that Drogon looks like Balerion for a reason, that they say he has the exact same coloration, black with red highlights. And they said, oh, it's like he's Balerion come again, reincarnated. He's probably Balerion's son, maybe his grandson. That's why he looks like him. It doesn't say who sired them, though, or who laid them, and in what generation. That all we really know is they were stolen by 56 AC, so like they probably weren't laid by Cyrax or Melis, because they weren't alive yet. It's what dragons were alive by 56. So maybe Dreamfire. Some people assumed it was Dreamfire because they were stolen from Rhaena. She was living on Dragonstone at the time. But, it says, when people are reading through quickly, they misunderstood that her dragon Dreamfire laid 3 eggs, but it says they hatched. It's not her eggs. They said they were stolen from the hatchery on Dragonstone, which means they could come from anyone. Maybe they're from Balerion and Vagar. Maybe they're from Balerion and Meraxes. We don't know. But you get the sense there of the lineage of Balerion, which is great because it ties the whole series together better that way. And people have been discussing this online, make of it what you will, of if the Braavosi were always afraid of the Valyrians, they were ex-slaves who fled Valyria, why were they helping Daenerys? She actually spent most of her childhood in Braavos, the house with the red door, and she bounced around a lot of the free cities, but we meet her in Pentos, but she spent a lot of time in Braavos as a child, and the secret pact between the Martells and the Targaryens that, Arianne was going to marry Viserys, signed by Oberyn, the secret treaty witnessed by the Sea Lord of Braavos, not the Prince of Pentos. There's something going on with the Braavosi in all of this, of trying to engineer the rise of the Targaryens, maybe. Why would they? We're not sure, but something is going on, and the Sea Lord, at least at that point in time, almost 200 years ago, 250 years ago, had the dragon eggs. And were they just sold to Illyrio for an obscene amount of money? We don't know. That they were so intent on keeping these dragon eggs that they forgave the national debt of Jaehaerys to the crown, of this big loan they had, rather than give them up. Because they said, look, we don't even know how to hatch them, assuming we have them, plausible deniability. So it's not worth fighting us for eggs we might not even be able to hatch. And Jaehaerys just said, the instant they manage to hatch those, there'll be trouble, but they never could. They tried and failed. Moving along, mostly I'm going to talk about the Jaehaerys stuff, just because that's what I've gotten through already, and the Conquest Sons of the Dragon stuff wasn't too much new, so let me just briefly cover that. It's interesting seeing the rise and fall of who is in favor at the royal court, and the rise and fall of great houses, which one's the powerful ones in different generations. And the World Book already explains this, that in the initial generations after the Conquest, houses involved in royal-level politics, people who got favors and small council seats, were their closest allies, like the Velaryons and the Baratheons, who were with them in the Conquest, but also the Hightowers because of their ties to the Faith of the Seven and the High Septon, the Tullys because they had voluntarily raised the Riverlands against House Horror for the Targaryens. They were very loyal, and to a lesser extent the Celtigars. And there's all this fighting over, they want to be the new second house in the realm behind the Velaryons or next to the Baratheons. That at this time, the Starks, but even the Lannisters, were not particularly close to the throne, nor, of course, were the Greyjoys. So I'm thinking in terms of if this is a TV show, would the Greyjoys be in it? Well, a little after the initial conquest, because there's that Lodos rebellion under Aenys, so there'd be a little bit of Greyjoys in there. The Lannisters do come into the story in Sons of the Dragon because that's where Rhaena and Aegon hide from Maegor. But the Starks, least of all, they're barely involved. The other two are barely involved. The Starks, not at all. After the conquest, you do not meet the Starks again until the time of Jaehaerys. So if this was all a show, or just as a book, like when do we get to see the Starks again in this? People like them. Well, it was pleasant to see, and there's a sample of this, that The Jaehaerys section has a big episode on him and Alysanne making a royal progress to the north, which is heavily revised from what the original novel said, and it prominently mixes in the Starks. The plot point they introduce, which is interesting, is that so many defeated members of the Faith Militant, as well as Maegor supporters, chose exile to the Night's Watch after Jaehaerys took over, that it was a huge glut, that they had trouble feeding them all, that they had 10,000 men during the conquest, and that wasn't quite enough, and then they really declined after the Targaryens stopped all the internal wars, because there weren't any more defeated men to send to the Night's Watch. For a time, right after the death of Maegor, they had too many men. And everyone was starting to worry, these men are all disloyal to Jaehaerys, that they're either hardcore Faith Militant who hate the Targaryens, or particularly some of Maegor's men. 2 of Maegor's Kingsguard were sent to the Night's Watch, and I guess enemy of my enemy, they came to lead the Faith Militant at the Wall into an open rebellion. There was this Night's Watch rebellion. So Lord Walton Stark died putting down this Night's Watch insurrection. This would be like a subplot in a TV show of, well, what are the Starks doing, and how does the Faith Militant uprising affect them? Well, it led to a Night's Watch rebellion, and they were a little... Walton died fighting it and was succeeded by his brother Alaric, so you might have seen from the preview that that's why he's a little stern with the Targaryens, that he blames them for indirectly causing his brother's death, even though he knows they didn't want that to happen. But he warms up them because they're nice to him. The next big tidbit is, it's just nice actually learning about the missing generation of Targaryens between King Jaehaerys and King Viserys I, his grandson who directly succeeded him. I mean, this is nothing huge. You don't get me wrong. It's like, oh wow, we're learning about these people that weren't even kings. It's just, this was a big gap in our knowledge since the late 1990s, and it's been frustrating for last 10 years I've been in this, almost 15 years now, that it's just family tree, unknown. There's just this gap in 300 years of Targaryen history. That's the one generation we didn't really know about. 13 children, of which 4 died young. And it's been slightly revised since the World Book. The new tree is out for free. It's just a few of the children who died in infancy got reshuffled and renamed. It doesn't really affect anything. But it's nice that now I can draw that family tree from memory because I read 100 pages about them. And, this is what all their personalities were like. And in terms of which ones are dragon riders, it's his oldest son, Aemon, rode Caraxes. He was the first rider of Caraxes. Then the next son, Balon, he rode Vagar. And then his sister wife, Alyssa, rode Melis. The rest weren't dragon riders. Also, we get updates to character descriptions, physical descriptions, which are good because... if you've been following along with the prequel novellas, this happened before, that when The Princess and the Queen came out, everyone just assumed Rhaenyra's 3 sons with Laenor Velaryon looked Valyrian, silver hair and purple eyes, and people made a lot of fan art, which we still use because no one updated the fan art, showing them with silver hair, only to then learn, 2 years later in The Rogue Prince, that they all had brown hair and eyes, and it's a plot point because people accuse them of being bastards. Well, they don't look Valyrian. Well, it turns out that Queen Alysanne didn't look Valyrian either. They said, well, she had the look of an attractive commoner, that she had honey blonde hair and blue eyes instead of purple. Because it also explains, well, her maternal grandmother was Alara Macy. That the Velaryons, her maternal side was Alyssa Velaryon. They look Valyrian too, but the Velaryon Lord's wife was a Macy, which they're not Valyrians. So sometimes people just look like one of their grandparents. I mean, think of Duncan Egg. Some of Egg's brothers don't look Valyrian because they have a Dornish grandmother or something. Also, Jocelyn, of Valyrian descent, and her daughter Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was, they both had black hair due to their Baratheon blood. They said Rhaenys had black hair and purple eyes. So, even Alysanne didn't look Targaryen. She didn't look like a Valyrian, and no one thought, oh, well, she's assuredly a bastard. Just stop. Stop. Rhaenyra's sons were not bastards. people taking that as proof, well, they must be a bastard. There are many Targaryens that don't look Valyrian. That doesn't mean they're bastards, damn it. Moving along. Next big interesting point was the Farman Expedition, or the Sun Chaser Expedition, we're not sure what to call it. Alyssa Farman of Fair Isle was an ex-lover of Princess Rhaena, and Fair Isle is off the west coast of the Westerlands, so they're one of the westernmost parts of the continent, and they're used to looking out over the Sunset Sea and wondering what's on the other side. So she got it in her head that we're going to make this big expedition to try to cross it. There's just this side episode in the book of how big is the world, and are there other continents? The World Book mentions these points in passing, but this really highlighted it. A big paragraph saying, we know the world is a globe. This isn't Discworld. And everyone from Valyria to Yi, all the scholars of the world know it's a globe. You can tell from astronomy and other stuff. But there's debate about how big it is. Some think it is too vast to sail west to Yi. There's just this giant ocean, you would run out of provisions. A few, like Corlys Velaryon, hope that, well, maybe it's small enough that there's a northwest passage to Yi. Alyssa got the rare idea that, only a few people have, maybe it's so big, the world is so big, that there are other continents the size of Westeros and Essos out there if we sail west. It's not just, it's this huge ocean the size of the Atlantic. Maybe there are entire other continents we haven't even heard of yet. So she went on this expedition with 2 other ships from the High Towers, and they actually found this new island chain that is not on the current world map. We will need to update that. And it's a small island chain. And she went, well, instead of going north and running into icebergs, we'll go further south in the warm waters. So she went southwest of the Summer Islands. And let me zoom in on the map here. They said it was west of the longitude of Lonely Light. This is the westernmost islands in the world. And south of the Summer Islands, because when they went back east, they missed the southern end of the Summer Islands and went right to Sothorios. So we'll have to update the map on this. It doesn't come with a map of these. There's this new island chain. It was uninhabited. And eventually, I want to keep looking for more continents. She went west and was never seen again, and the other ships went back home because they were damaged. We'll update that as we find more about it. Are there hints in Fire and Blood about Empire of Ash, the Doom of Valyria prequel TV series? Unfortunately, there were no overt references. Like if they referred to leaked factions by name, like the Sphinxes or the Young Dragons, there was no solid proof like that. However, consider that the Jaehaerys section was chronologically written last about 1 year ago. Empire of Ash was the first prequel pitch. Work began 2 years ago in 2016. All the other chapters were, except for a few touch-ups, already written by 2012 to 2014. Point being, Martin wrote the Jaehaerys section after working out Valyria prequel details. So that was in his head when he was writing this, and any hints would really be in that one. This is the new stuff he made after coming up with the Empire of Ash notes. Well, his chapter includes a side trip to Sothorios. When that expedition's members are coming back, they get stranded and their ship gets damaged. They spend a year on the coast. Perhaps to remind us all of remember Sothorios? Because it's a major location in Empire of Ash. The Valyrian province there is like Roman North Africa, and it rises in revolt against Valyria. Or when Alysanne visits the Citadel in Old Town, she attends several lectures, one of which it just says was on Valyrian Dragon Wars. And we knew all of this already. It isn't revealing anything. It's just, were you trying to remind us of this? Because it's about to come out as this other prequel idea. Of course, the biggest thing that I really did double take me, is that a hint? Because it's not new, but he's really emphasizing it. There's this, arguably the highlight of the book is this terrifying moment where someone goes to Valyria, post-Doom Valyria, and it's just horrible, and we don't see what happens. They just come back and die, and they're wondering what the hell is going on in Valyria. I won't put more in than that, because it's great, straight out of Lovecraft stuff. And this is like stuff that was stray mentions in the World Book that he is now hammering home to us. The Valyrians were more than dragon lords. They practiced blood magic and other dark arts as well, delving deep into the earth for secrets best left buried and twisting the flesh of beasts and men to fashion monstrous and unnatural chimeras. For these sins the gods in their wrath struck them down. Okay, I've used eSearch, like a search of ice and fire, to check this. This is the first time throughout the entire Song of Ice and Fire series, including the World Book, that the word chimera has ever been used. It struck me as odd, because normally he uses the word sphinx. And I talk about this at length in my Riddle of the Sphinx video for Empire of Ash. If you haven't seen it, please check it out. About the faction known as the Sphinxes. They're the magic faction, that if the young dragons are the military, I have a sword faction, and the freeholders are the banker merchant faction, the Sphinxes are the warlock priest faction of a sort, that they're strong in blood magic. And all these things about Maester Aemon cryptically saying the Sphinx is the riddle, not the Riddler, possibly hinting that the Valyrians literally hybridized their bloodline with dragons in order to bond with them. That's a theory. I mean, the definition given for what a sphinx is in the fourth novel by one character is that a sphinx is a bit of this and a bit of that, a mashup of different animals. That he could just as equally have used the term chimera, but Martin preferred using the term sphinx. He never uses the term chimera throughout the whole novel series. He mentions things like sphinxes or manticores or stuff, but never chimera. Now, it seems as if he's hitting us over the head with this, bluntly emphasizing that blood magic made genetic chimeras. That's a real-life term for animals that are DNA spliced with other animals. Genetic chimeras. And it's not information we didn't have before, but he's making it very clear and very prominent in this speech a character gives through a letter, that I got a feeling that, wait a minute, was this setting up something in Empire of Ash? Please discuss this in the comments. It really felt prominent of, maybe it's just to have a fun episode with this. It was a really great piece of writing. A lot of people are saying this is one of the highlights of the book. But also, like, what are you trying to set up with this? Or for the main novels with Blood of the Dragon, we're not sure. Next point, the post-Doom Targaryens of Dragonstone during the Century of Blood. That's the century between the Doom and when Aegon the Conqueror invaded the rest of Westeros. A lot of people were hoping for a new section on them, any new material. There wasn't a new section. It starts right with the Aegon the Conqueror chapter that was in the World Book. And because it repeats that Aegon's Conquest chapter starts with a single paragraph sketch about the 7 generations from Aenar through Aegon the Conqueror. Aenar was the first generation, Aegon the Conqueror was the 7th. Like the second generation was Aenar's daughter Daenerys the Dreamer and her brother husband Gaemon the Glorious, and so on and so forth through 7 generations. And there wasn't a new paragraph or subsection on any of them. It just repeats what we already had from the World Book. There were 1 or 2 other points mentioned in entirely different sections of the book, like the Jaehaerys section. It repeats, albeit prominently, that we already knew this, that Aenar brought 5 dragons to Dragonstone. The youngest was Balerion. The other 4 died over time, so Balerion was the last living creature that had seen Valyria. But that was just a plot point and something else. And like 1 or 2 of Jaehaerys' children were named after Targaryen ancestors from this time period. This is probably the biggest quote from that. Is really just this and nothing else. Is one of his children, who died in infancy anyway, was named in honor of Gaemon the Glorious, the greatest of the Targaryen lords who ruled on Dragonstone before the conquest. And he was the brother-husband of Daenerys the Dreamer, and actually her co-ruler. And these will be characters in Empire of Ash. Daenerys, they told me she will be in it. Logically, Gaemon, her brother-husband, will be in it by the end at least. But that isn't really saying anything new if you think about it, that Gaemon was the greatest of them. Well, logically, think about it. He had 5 dragons, and, like, Aegon's father, the 6th generation, Aerion, he had less than that, because they died over time. Aegon the First had only 3, Balerion, Meraxes, and Vagar, so inherently, Gaemon had 5 compared to his 3. 5! 3, sir! Just, he had more dragons, therefore he was the greatest. That makes sense. It doesn't necessarily mean he did anything. Just, why do you call him the Glorious? I'm not sure. Just for the sake of completion, I should probably go over this very quickly. Here is a family tree of all of the Targaryens in the Century of Blood, 7 generations inclusive, from Aenar Generation 1 to Aegon the Conqueror Generation 7. We already knew this from the World of Ice and Fire, and it's just reiterated at the beginning of Fire and Blood, and we know nothing about these people beyond this family tree, just explaining this was this one's brother, he succeeded him, no details of their lives. Starts with Aenar the Exile, know nothing about his wives, then Gaemon the Glorious and Daenerys the Dreamer. Their children, who were also a brother-sister marriage, were Aegon and Olenna, and they were the first generation born on Dragonstone. Daenerys and Gaemon came from Valyria. Then even I mix up generations 4 and 5, guys. There's nothing notable and memorable enough to keep it straight about them. That I remember there's 2 brothers and then 3 brothers, but officially it's Aegon and Olenna's sons, Maeggon, who apparently died childless, then Aerys. Don't even know who Aerys' wife was. Then his 3 sons, Aelix, Balon, and Damian. The first 2 apparently didn't have children. Damian, again, apparently had an unknown wife. Was it a younger Targaryen sister, or was it a Velaryon? We don't know. Then, snapping back into focus near the end, because it's getting closer to the conquest, we have Aegon's father, Aerion Targaryen. Not to be confused with Aerion Brightflame, who was Maester Aemon's older brother, the one who drank wildfire. He was named after the original Aerion. Aerion married Valenna Velaryon and had 3 legitimate children with her, Visenya, Aegon, and Rhaenys, from the Conquest. And in this same paragraph, it mentions, oh, well, Valenna Velaryon was half Targaryen on her mother's side, but doesn't bother explaining it or naming her, that she has a Targaryen mother. We would assume some unnamed younger daughter of Aerys, a younger sister of Damien's generation. It's not clear that they're floating around in there, but this is problems from the World Book. Fire and Blood just repeated it. And of course, it was pretty much an open secret that Aerion had a bastard son, Orys Baratheon, who was Aegon the Conqueror's closest and only friend in Hand of the King. Fire and Blood didn't give any new information on that, and actually confirmed that no one knows. That of who was his mother, no one knows anything. There aren't even rumors about who she was. That Jaehaerys talks about it decades after he died, and Jaehaerys was like 3 years old when Orys died. But, his father, Aenys, when he was younger, knew older Orys. Orys was his uncle. And Jaehaerys said, well, from the way my parents talked about it, it was pretty much an open secret that everyone knew Orys was a Targaryen bastard. It's just that it was never officially formalized. But he said it was an open secret, everyone knew. But it's when they were talking about First Night, he said, as for whether he was conceived in First Night or not, I honestly have no idea. That for all I know, he was just some Aerion fathered a child on a prostitute in a brothel or something. We don't know. And a couple of news sites just breezing through this went, oh, this book reveals that the Baratheons are part Targaryen. Okay, this book didn't reveal that, and it's not because of Orys. That, yes, the later Targaryens like Stannis, Shireen, even Gendry are officially part Targaryen because of a later intermarriage that King Robert's grandmother was a younger Targaryen princess. So that was an official union. This was openly, it was an open secret that this was a bastard relationship, but it was never formally acknowledged on a legal level. So nothing changed with Orys because of Fire and Blood. They didn't clarify any of, well, who is Valyna Velarion's mother, but this is the family tree going into this book, and nothing really changed. Except for one interesting piece. Wow, it's not that interesting, it's something new. In the middle of the book, there's a one-page mention during the Great Council of the Year 101, when there's 13 different claimants that Jaehaerys is old and dying, and his second son and heir just died of a burst appendix. So all of these obscure relatives came to argue their case, and it says, at the Great Council of 101, another contestant produced sheafs of parchment that demonstrated his descent from Gaemon the Glorious, the greatest of the Targaryen lords of Dragonstone before the conquest, by way of a younger daughter and the petty lord she married, and so on for 7 generations. Page 346. Now, I don't know if that guy was telling the truth or not. It doesn't matter. I think he was, but it doesn't matter, because the fact is everyone acknowledged that Gaemon had a younger daughter. The question was whether he was really her descendant or not. That's neither here nor there. So here's what we knew going into this book, and now coming out of it, here's the update. That Daenys the Dreamer didn't just have Aegon and Olenna, Gaemon and Daenys also had a younger daughter. Okay, this is slightly more interesting than if it was Maegor or Aerys, that when we get a prequel about the Doom of Valyria, Aenar, Gaemon, and Daenys will be characters, on-screen characters. So we just learned a new detail, albeit a minor detail, about a fairly important character, Daenys the Dreamer, that she had a third child. But that is really all we found out about the Targaryens of Dragonstone during the Century of Blood. Now this is where things get interesting. Points in Fire and Blood where it appears that George R.R. Martin may be criticizing the Game of Thrones TV series. Yeah, this is the first publication he's really put out since Book 5. Like the other prequel novellas, as I said, they were written by 2014. That this is the first big writing that Martin has put out, the Jaehaerys section. And there's 2 things from it that really, not just me, other people are going, wait a minute, is this a spilling tea about the TV show? Well, first of these 2 things is Martin repeatedly spells out that dragons have a finite maximum flight range. And one of these was in the free sample online. A lot of people picked up on this. That wasn't the only time he mentioned how far a dragon can go and that there's a limit to it. In the free sample of Alysanne visiting the Wall, and many took note, is he criticizing the TV show's Season 7's ridiculous White Hunt storyline with Dany flying directly from Dragonstone to the Wall in a single day. And it's just, I have a whole video on that. If you're going to do that, you have a map in your opening credits. The episode begins with a panning shot over the table map from Dragonstone to the Wall, emphasizing to TV-only non-book fans, this is half a continent. And then you were surprised that casual people who are not book fans versus TV fans, were going, this strains credibility, you're breaking your own rules. Again, I talk about this so much more in another video, TV Tropes calls this the principle of magic A is magic A. They're magical dragons. Well, yeah, but you have established rules about them that you then can't break. That they can't teleport across a continent. That we know how fast the Raven Network is. The Gendry, multiple parts of this are terrible. Like, Gendry can't run that fast. But the big point is, dragons cannot remotely fly that far. In a single flight, that's something like 4 times their maximum flight distance. But there's more than was just in that sample section. There's just a couple. There's more than this. These are the big ones I remember that I wrote down. First off, from the Alysanne thing, visiting the North and the Wall, it says, even flying from Winterfell to the Wall is not negligible for a dragon. That she had to stop at Last Hearth, the seat of House Umber, and a couple of other places. Other points, that when she's traveling, or when Rhaenyra's son is traveling to the north to gain allies, goes from Dragonstone to the Three Sisters Islands off the north coast of the Vale, or the Erie, then to White Harbor, then Winterfell, then Last Hearth, then the Wall. That cannot possibly be a single flight trip for a dragon. It would get exhausted. It's like a horse. You can't ride a horse indefinitely. It'll get tired. It has a limited range. Or for like cavalry, it shifts that there's a maximum range at which you could plausibly ride the horse to get a messenger there, but the horse would be exhausted. Like men, like infantry, well, we could run there, but then we couldn't fight a battle. That a dragon would be tired. And granted, Jaehaerys and Alysanne are just visiting these places, so they're not life or death running somewhere else to save someone. These are comfortable distances that plausibly they could go farther than this. But Winterfell to the Wall, to get to Winterfell, we go to the Three Sisters, then White Harbor, then Winterfell. The big one that Westeros.org, Elio and Linda were bringing up a lot and criticizing the White Hunt is Dragonstone to King's Landing, just because it comes up so many times. Throughout the prequel eras, the Targaryens are shuttling back and forth between the Targaryen castle on Dragonstone and King's Landing a lot, which is a sizable distance over open water, or Dragonstone to Pentos. That they give enough how many days this takes, that it's a reasonably long distance. And another big one is that flying from King's Landing to Old Town is long for a dragon. It states that. So, to go meet the High Septon, they had to stop at Bitterbridge, then Highgarden. And again, they plausibly could ride farther than this because it wasn't a matter of life and death. This was just a comfortable state visit distance. Like not riding your horse to death just to visit, but still. Now the rest of this is going to be me. I made crude maps of this. That you see on the left there, White Harbor to Winterfell, then Winterfell, Last Hearth, Castle Black. A direct flight from Winterfell to Castle Black I made in yellow because it's long for a dragon, or Dragonstone, Erie, Three Sisters, White Harbor. Here you have the other trip when Jaehaerys goes and Alysanne go to Old Town. They stop at Bitterbridge is one of the main choke points in the Reach that goes over the Mander. Bitterbridge, then Highgarden, then Old Town. I apologize because this is in video form. I have the wall map from Lands of Ice and Fire out mounted on my wall. If you have one, look yourself, just eyeballing it. It's not... They mocked us after the White Hunt. Oh, you're taking out your protractors? I don't need a number. If it's 1 mile, 100, or 1,000. If you've established Old Town is about as south of King's Landing as Winterfell is north of it, and they're both comparable distances, this is relative. But again, it's breaking your own rules of this is considered a long distance for a dragon. And not just a little long, it's like this is 4 times the distance a dragon would drop dead from exhaustion. Like, they cannot do this, and this assuredly isn't in the upcoming books. So, Yellow Line is a direct flight, they can't do that, and they have to stop at these points. So, here's my big combined map of all the stopping points, and when you look at it, like spokes on a wheel from Dragonstone, you got people fly to Harrenhal, King's Landing, Storm's End, the Erie, or Pentos from Dragonstone. And I add in here a circle to show, well, okay, it looks like a ring of maximum comfortable flight distance. And not much really changed from this that we didn't already know. If you just eyeball, I just use a piece of paper and go, oh, is this roughly, assuming the map is the scale? I know how silly this is. That the greatest distance we've ever heard of a dragon flying non-stop is basically from Dragonstone to Pentos, that they can cross the Narrow Sea. And you saw that, like all these other stops, like Bitterbridge to Highgarden isn't as long as Dragonstone to Pentos. That was the measure that Elio and Linda were using as the maximum they think a dragon can fly for a really long flight. Maybe twice that long would be crazy. And going back to the main map here, that the wall is 4 times the distance from Dragonstone to Pentos. I would cheat and go, maybe it could fly directly to Winterfell and drop dead of exhaustion at the end, but this is not you can't do that. They've established what is considered a long distance with dragons, but there's other references throughout the book of how far dragons can fly, but the sample chapter alone, the free sample, check it out, of Winterfell to the Wall is something that a dragon can't do. And just playing around with this for fun, what might the implications be for Empire of Ash, which will have dozens of dragons, and the Dragon Wars of the Valyrian Dragon Lords? That the big problem is that the Freeholders faction, their stronghold is in Zamatar, which is in Sothorios. It's this province that's sort of like Roman North Africa. And I took this from, I didn't combine two maps because I wanted the scale to be right, that I cropped this down for a world map of, okay, this is Dragonstone to Pentos. I'm using that as my yardstick for what is a normal distance. I just copy-pasted it to repeat it to get a rough idea of this is the range of dragons from the coast of the Valyrian Peninsula. I don't think that dragons can fly directly from the Valyrian Peninsula to Zamatar. Not even from Valyria. Valyria isn't on the coast, it's up in the mountains. That even from the coast, the Summer Sea is too wide to go straight to Zamatar from. Plausibly, I think they might be able to travel to the northernmost of the Basilisk Isles. And think of this like, just imagine what would the wars in Empire of Ash be like. Kind of think of the Pacific Theater in World War II, that the island hopping campaign, that there were certain points when they took Iwo Jima, they were already in bombing distance of Tokyo, but only their longest range bombers, and they couldn't stop anywhere to repair if they lost fuel. The whole point in taking Iwo Jima was to get a better, closer base for refueling and repairing damaged ones. That preferably you want to launch an attack from like an island, like Normandy, you want to launch from England within sight of the coast of France, so your planes can stay in the air all day because they're fresh with fuel. You, as a dragon, you don't want to fly from King's Landing to Winterfell and then fight a battle at the end of it. You want to fly over to the next valley and have it able to fight all day because it's not exhausted. So just eyeballing on a map, how far can you... Oceans would be a serious deterrent to dragons. There's another point in the book where Jaehaerys goes, we should look for that ship that sailed over the Sunset Sea, and his advisors tell him, even Alicent has to tell him, what if your dragon gets exhausted over open water? That he couldn't fly back to land. So this will be a major strategic military concern that I think one of the reasons the Freeholders' power base might be in Sothorios, aside from the fact that it's the richest province, is it would actually be difficult for them to make a direct attack on it. They'd have to take the basilisks. And if they were smart, they'd fill them with anti-air defense, scorpion bolts and stuff of the type that took down Meraxes. But this is just me playing with that. And I was using the analogy of Iwo Jima as an air base, that in the novels we heard so much about that the Giscari and the Valyrians were fighting over Battle Isle in the middle of Slaver's Bay. They would probably need a launching point for attacks against Geese itself. A closer launching point. Now that was the first point where it seemed like, wait a minute, is Martin making a criticism of the TV show here? Because this is the first thing he's written, really written since 2014, since the TV show went off the rails. But everyone kind of picked up on that. It's part of a preview chapter. There's just more of it. Dragon distances. The second one is a caution for young girls. He actually mentions this in the Colbert interview, pointing out, Tolkien had very idealized characters that they didn't, have sex in it. There's not really sex in Tolkien, and that there's sex in his books. And there's also even erotica, that these are realistic human beings. They have brothels, they have erotica. I think there's some mention that in the pre-existing books that Renly has a fairly good-sized collection of gay porn, that erotic drawing books that he had bought in the Free Cities and shared with Loras, that they said he has a collection of drawing books in the Free Cities that would make a septon faint or something. But, okay, these are people who have brothels and visit prostitutes already, that they're human. And he brought up to Colbert that, oh yeah, there's this thing where a historian had to go and actually scrutinize this source that someone said a serving woman was hired to seduce the king, and some say he did, others say she failed. The real debate is about who hired her in this attempt to split up Jaehaerys and Alysanne that didn't work. And because all the people writing the histories at the time were embarrassed about it, they didn't write about it. So this historian living hundreds of years later is forced to go, look, the only thing that really talks about this in any detail is this trashy erotica book, which is totally making up fantasy in it, but parts of it seemed real enough that I'll at least mention it. That, well, she said it was Lord Baratheon, other people said it was Lord Baratheon's son who hired her, that it's just plausible enough that he's holding his nose to mention this led to a wide theory because this book is circulated. So, because I don't think many of you who haven't read it already have heard of this, it hasn't made the rounds through the news sites yet, I don't want to mangle Martin's words, so I'm going to cite what he said here. And you draw your conclusions from it. This is in the USA hardcover, page 156. And now, unfortunately, we must give some consideration to a certain distasteful book that first appeared in the Seven Kingdoms some 40 years after the events presently being discussed. Copies of this book still pass from hand to hand in the low places of Westeros, and may oft be found in certain brothels, those catering to patrons able to read, it's not all of them, and libraries of noblemen of low morals, where they are best kept under lock and key, hidden from the eyes of maidens, good wives, children, and the chaste and pious. The book in question is known under various titles. There's variants of it. Amongst them, Sins of the Flesh, The High and Low, A Wanton's Tale, and The Wickedness of Men. But all versions bear the subtitle, A Caution for Young Girls. It purports to be the testimony of a young maid of noble birth who surrendered her virtue to a groom in her lord father's castle, gave birth to a child out of wedlock, and thereafter found herself partaking of every sort of wickedness imaginable during a long life of sin. And because she was already a fallen woman, they sent her as a servant to try to seduce the king. So, the full title would be Sins of the Flesh, A Caution for Young Girls. And other ones have a variant title, but if you're looking for it in a wiki article or something, the title, he continues to refer to it by the subtitle, because that's the one thing they share. Over the years and centuries, as the book was copied and recopied, many changes and emendations crept into the text. The maesters, this isn't a very literate society, that books aren't that common. They're something for the rich and the nobles. That the maesters who labor at the Citadel copying books are rigorously trained to reproduce the original word for word. They're like real-life medieval monks. But few mundane scribes are so disciplined. The poor do not have access to good copying mechanisms. As for septas, septons, and holy sisters that copy and illuminate books for the faith, they will strike out or alter any passages they believe to be offensive, obscene, or theologically unsound. So as virtually the whole of A Caution for Young Girls is obscene, it was not like to have been transcribed by either maesters or septons. This is something, copied by someone who's semi-literate, not at what we would consider a high school level trashy fanfic. And given the number of copies known to exist, several hundred, though as many more were burned by Baelor the Blessed, the scribes responsible were most likely septons expelled from the faith for drunkenness, wastrel septons, theft, fornication, or failed students who left the Citadel without a chain, washouts from the Citadel, or even hired writers from the Free Cities. The Free Cities don't have as many hang-ups about that. They actually have, professional-grade erotica and stuff. But so here's the interesting part. Or hired quills from the Free Cities, or mummers, the worst of all. Mummers is a common term in the books. It's what they call the combination of everyone it's a catch-all term for actors, theater writers, low-grade entertainment stuff, actors in theater. Or mummers, the worst of all. Lacking the rigor of maesters, such scribes oft feel free to, quote, improve on the text they are copying. Mummers in particular are prone to this. In the case of A Caution for Young Girls, such, quote, improvements largely consisted of adding ever more episodes of depravity and changing the existing episodes to make them even more disturbing and lascivious. And to wrap this up, as alteration followed alteration over the years, it became more difficult to ascertain which was even the original. And it's funny, because he was already doing this in The Princess of the Queen. Well, there's one history by Eustace, which is pro-Aegon II, and one by Munkin, which is pro-Rhaenyra, and we're trying to sort out between the two of them what really happened. And here, all he has to go on are 4 variant versions of a poorly copied piece of fanfic erotica by someone who's semi-literate. And he's just saying, I wouldn't do this if it wasn't the only source that talked about this. It was so scandalous, no one wanted to talk about it in the official histories. So he's trying to bait, well, in this other version of this semi-literate erotica you would find in a brothel, that sins of the flesh, high and low. So we don't even know what the title is, so we call it A Caution for Young Girls after the subtitle. Those titled Sins of the Flesh and the High and Low tend to be the older versions, and, because they're the shortest, they're probably older, while A Wanton's Tale and The Wickedness of Men are probably later versions, as they include more additions. So, if you have this and haven't gotten to it yet, it's pages 157 to 159 US hardcover. So, everyone's been talking about this on my Twitter feed, amongst others lately, of just, is this Martin making a swipe at Benioff and Weiss for saying, oh no, we're improving it for TV, and you just added in a bunch of sex scenes for clearly meant that you enjoy them as this dude bro frat guy. That this isn't just like the way True Blood would have sex scenes in it for HBO, that this is just debasing. But other people I've talked to said, we think he's just making fun of fanfic writers, because he's notorious for not liking fanfic, which can be pretty crappy, that this isn't like a professional attempt at writing a spin-off novella. You wrote fanfic filled with sex scenes. And then you got offended when people told you this could never fit in the book itself. Not just your right to make it and enjoy it amongst yourselves, but please read this erotica fanfic for A Song of Ice and Fire. Look how great it is. It's just as good as the novels. No, it is not. If it was good enough to be a novel, you would make it. I don't know. So maybe, it's vague enough that maybe he's just making fun. He's been in the business for so long with adaptations of so many other things, and in TV industry he's been in, that maybe he's just talking about fan fiction. But I did a double take at this when it was in the text and went, this sounds like he's making fun of the TV show. So please talk about that in the comments. Last section here, I put this at the end just because it's not the most exciting stuff to the casual reader, but it is to me. Just general world-building details in the Jaehaerys the First sections. I like the world-building because a single character can die. That people who get so invested in that I am reading this as the Jon Snow show, or the Renly show, or the Catelyn Stark show, because they're POV narrators, and it's the world of Westeros doesn't die. It's a continent. That if you're learning about, these are details about how the Faith of the Seven works, versus, like Robert Baratheon could die, Asha Greyjoy could die, and that's the end of her story. So the world building never ends, and it continues on into other prequels. Like details about dragons will be just as valid for a prequel, whereas the course of the War of the Five Kings will be done with by the end of A Song of Ice and Fire. So I like world-building stuff in general, because it never ends. But little interesting fleshing out the world things, which are, building wiki stuff. So I'm just going to race through these. A little more, we knew already that King's Landing was a boom town and no one planned it. Just how bad it was, even before Jaehaerys tried to reform it, that if you think, like, Flea Bottom is bad now, under King Robert, that 200 years before, 50 years before Jaehaerys, there was nothing there. It was a fishing village at the mouth of a river, and 50 years later, it had just mushroomed in size, and there was no planning. it was this boom town, and every couple of pages, I'm not going to summarize it, they give another update about its incremental expansion. It's like watching a city builder sim playing out of like, well, now we need a church because there's this many people, and now we need a bigger church, and well, okay, we have a castle that has kitchens, so now we can't just have a wooden stockade, we need to have an oven made of slate that can feed 50 people, and it needs made of slate so it won't burn down the wooden stockade, and just incrementally they were adding more and more things. And there was nothing there, and when Jaehaerys came to power 48 AC, there were 100,000 people in it. And during the course of his 55-year reign, it stated it quadrupled in size, from 100,000 people to over 400,000. And in the present-day War of the Five Kings era, it is stated multiple times to be about 500,000, give or take when wars and plagues happen. That there was nothing there. There weren't straight roads. They were just buildings slapped down, and the roads, there weren't roads. They were mud. So, you know, we need to make all of the streets you hear about, like the Street of the Sisters, the Central Square, they had to carve out of tarred shacks, basically, that were obstructing the straight lines, and lay down cobblestones. He built all of that. That it was just basically a giant shanty town. With no planning whatsoever, just how bad it was. And other little logical things like, you know, we kind of always assumed, but for some reason it never clicked in my mind, that the wealthiest neighborhoods are on top of the three hills. And I kind of knew, you know, that the Great Sept is on Visenya's Hill, that the high-end brothels are on the top of Rhaenys' Hill near the Dragon Pit. Obviously, Aegon's High Hill is where the Red Keep is. But it's stated the poor neighborhoods like Flea Bottom are in the valleys between the three hills because shit rolls downhill. That just, when rains come and flush all of the offal and sewage into the streets, it runs downhill into the poor region. So logically, the rich people buy up the ones that are higher up on the hills. That's why Flea Bottom is where it is. It's just for some reason, it was never clearly stated, so it never clicked on my mind of, oh, that's why it's there before. Other things that are just logical ripple effects, just, you know, it's fun when you see the ripple effects of a historical event happening, of, well, these are the results that would happen from that. Logical ripple effects of the Targaryen unification and peace. That, think about it, this continent had never been at peace before. For the first time, they unified the Seven Kingdoms. So, it stated, the long peace by Jaehaerys' time resulted in the population of Westeros north of Dorne doubling. That by the middle of his reign, it had doubled. Dorne got hammered in the First Dornish War, so their population was pretty low, but doubled. Also, previously, when lords had a population boom, to feed their people, you know, it was easier to invade the farms of their neighbors than carve out new land from wilderness, farmland. So this was no longer possible. That the Targaryens said no more fighting each other. So they said on a historical scale of centuries that there was an unprecedented burst in clearing wilderness to create new farms and towns. I'm talking about, like, if you're doing your own fan mods, good structured fanfic, not erotic, you know, / you know, military campaign mods to, like, Age of Empires, to, like, Total War or something, that, well, my story is set 1,000 years before the conquest, the whole big era between the Andal invasions and the Targaryen invasion, that a lot of the towns we know about now didn't exist. Like Lord Harroway's town didn't exist. They state when they found it, when they created it, that a lot more of Westeros was old-growth forest that hadn't been cleared yet, or just brambles and wilderness, that this was when a lot of that got cleared. That the Wolf's Wood was bigger, that the Rainwood covered a lot more land, and they had to clear that. And, you know, this is, for me, because I'm a medievalist, that there's this whole thing about land hunger in the Middle Ages, and, you know, comparing this to medieval Europe, it's called the saturation point. They hadn't hit the saturation point yet of what the entire realm could plausibly sustain at their technology level. when people go, oh, the Crusades were fought because of land hunger, that younger sons couldn't get land in Europe. No, we have done extensive demographic research. That was one of the areas I looked up, that they know people could get land easily enough in medieval Europe at the eve of the Crusades. There was enough wilderness that just needed to be resettled because invasions and plagues had gutted the population after the fall of Rome, that they went on crusade because of their religious beliefs, for good or ill, but it wasn't because of land hunger. We know just due to economics and math that it wasn't land hunger, that there was still land that could plausibly be cleared. Up until this point with the Targaryens. Now, another thing which I thought was really interesting, just because it had never occurred to me before, even though it just was so obvious and logical, that of ripple effects of the Targaryens, we already knew that the Targaryens put a stop to Ironborn raids around the coasts, right? And from the shipping lanes, the fishing lanes, for the first time in thousands of years, that there had never been safe sea lanes to this extent before. So, logically, this led to an unprecedented burst in growth of fishing villages. The coasts were relatively safe now. And there's this point in it where it states, officially, fish became affordable to commoners for the first time, that historically fish was not something commoners ate. So, given that for millennia, thousands of years, they didn't think of fish as a traditional food for, regular people, that you think there must be lingering cultural connotations that fish is a food of the rich. I was talking about this over Twitter with the author of the wonderful A Feast of Ice and Fire, in stores now, the wonderful in-universe cookbook with a foreword by George R.R. Martin for how to make stuff from Westeros. And in the same section, they're talking about, well, these are luxury foods that we're going to put luxury taxes on to raise more revenue for the crown. And they list off the top 5 spices that they use as pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, and saffron, which were also, I looked this up, the top 5 spices that were produced by the Dutch East India Company. These are the major spices of the world. Why is that important, and why did I look it up? Well, because whoever controls the spice controls the money, and the spice must flow. I'm talking about, like, Valyria prequels and stuff, that the rich merchants who control the spice trade enough to be able to hire sellsword armies, well, what kind of spices do they have, and where are they grown? When you're talking about mercenary wars over the spice industry. So these are the top 5. So combine that with the whole fish was historically a food of the rich, even though it's, cheaper now in the past 300 years. For a long time it wasn't. You think about, in the books, the noblemen are frequently eating spiced fish dishes. There's this quote from Dance with Dragons, the first Davos chapter, where he says, saffron was literally worth more than gold, and Davos had only tasted it once before when King Robert had sent half a fish to him at a feast on Dragonstone. So they're showing off their wealth by serving fish with saffron from Yiti, which is their version of China. And in the show, you'll see, like, Tyrion eating lamprey pie, that fish was considered a food of the rich. Just as a world-building detail, it's just, yeah, it would be, because of the Ironborn, it's not that safe to fish. Another thing which didn't occur to me then, yeah, that would be an issue. The Seven Kingdoms didn't just fight each other. It states their vassals also feuded with each other all the time to solve land disputes or whatever. So, like, even within the Westerlands, like, the Marbrands and the Westerlings would be fighting each other, and then the Lannisters would be fighting the Gardner Kings to the south. So, all of that endemic warfare was put to an end. And we already knew that they said that led to a decline in the Night's Watch because there weren't as many men from the defeated sides in wars going to join. Though, conversely, major wars every now and again led to occasional gluts, like when Maegor died. But the point is, a major job of the Faith militant, and we knew this already, they stated this in, like, the 4th novel, a major job of the Faith Militant used to be defending travelers and pilgrims on the rough, slow local roads. Banning the Faith Militant meant that overland travel ground to a halt. That they didn't have these royal highways like the King's Road. They had regional mud paths, some of which were decent, but, there's rain, it gets muddy, it gets washed out. You come to a halt, bandits ambush you, they know where to lay ambushes. So, for thousands of years, the Faith Militant would travel with these caravans defending people along as they make their circuit through all the little local roads that aren't really up to quality. So suddenly the roads are these crappy local roads are all defenseless and just overland travel stopped. So that is one of the reasons that Jaehaerys started the Royal Highway projects. It was in direct reaction to that, one of the ripple effects of defeating the Faith Militant. That just the elegance of that, I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, without the Faith Militant, how would the roads work? So they needed better highways. That's all I'm going to talk about Fire and Blood right now. This is just initial reactions. Though I will say everyone's really excited that it debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list for fiction, which is pretty cool. There's a lot more I can and will talk about through text or online, and at some point I'm probably going to make a part 2 to this once I've thoroughly gone through the second half of the book for the Dance of the Dragons stuff through the Regency, really heavy. These are little points I find interesting for wiki purposes. It can be anything from, this is how Milk of the Poppy gets made, to, this is how this battle really happened. So I'm going to go over that. These are my initial reactions through the middle when the end of Jaehaerys' rule. And don't wait up for that, I'll just knock that off eventually. Like I said, this video is also a channel update because I've been dark for a month because I was working on a lot of stuff, and then I realized, even if I get this out right now, everyone's reading Fire and Blood anyway, so I am sitting on a lot of backlogged stuff that is already scripted out. So, if you're still with me here, channel update for the future, dear subscribers. I do want to get around to the biography of David Benioff series and Inside the Mind of David Benioff, plus the Sansa stuff, with maybe a short Daenerys video. And originally, if you saw months ago, I had something saying I'm going to make thematic videos about interesting stuff, remakes of some really crappy ones I made when I just started making videos, like Medieval Economics and Food and Drink, were made on my old laptop, which had a terrible microphone. So I want to redo them at better quality with a few new bits of info from Fire and Blood, like Food and Drink would talk about spices a bit more, or, this is something they say about wine in Fire and Blood. So I'm going to remake those, but look for those in spring or something, around February-ish. So I can make no promises, though, but people are going to be reading Game of Thrones stuff a lot more leading up to Season 8 in April, and I want to catch that wave with this content. So the stuff that I made already, which is coming, it is scripted, some of them are even recorded, are a definitive analysis of the proposed Long Night prequel series. Everything, okay, this is what we know about the Long Night, this is what could be in it, this is what can't be in it. Because we know nothing. Okay, well, King's Landing isn't in it. The Wall wouldn't be in it at the beginning. River Run doesn't exist yet, that sort of thing. So, a definitive analysis, just going through lists of this is what there could be, this is what there can't be, this is what we know. And I have titled it, Why the Long Night Prequel is a Bad Idea. And if that sounds petulant, keep in mind, even winteriscoming.net openly put out an op-ed saying Long Night Prequel is a bad idea, make Empire of Ash the Duke of Valyria prequel. That was something like 3 hours long, and it's split into 2 parts, combined length of 3 hours, so that's a lot of stuff which is backlogged and half-finished. Coming next, I had to stop in the middle of, I hadn't even finished the Empire of Ash videos. Empire of Ash, The Freeholders Part 2, Geography and Sothorios, which I thought would be short, and it turned into a huge overview, nearly 2 hours long, and a lot of it talks about what they told me about This is stuff we'll see physically at what we anticipate the budget for what sets we could build and actually show, which was interesting. Then part 3 of 3 on the Freeholders, the Freeholders POV character, which should actually be relatively short. And then a conclusion video, Magic in a World of Low Fantasy, or Realism in a World of Magic. I'm debating titles, just to tie it all together. Now, I'm going to make shorter preview. The idea I came up with is, you know, when I make the Benioff biography, it's going to be this 2 to 3 hour monstrosity that will be definitively taking him out. And it's my Mueller report, basically, which I will show around to fan site leaders. And we'll plan our next step. That everyone said we just found him so abhorrent, we could not go through all of his prior interviews. You know, things he said about himself, with cited quotes, like from the DVD commentary for 25th Hour, which is, how did no one report this? This is an absurd statement and would get him in trouble. This is real, dear God. So, to drum up support for that, I'm going to be making these short preview clips intermittently after the Empire of Ash and Long Night stuff is done. And also to highlight some of these issues, that this is just a sampling. And these would be like 5-10 minutes long, that Benioff admits on camera that guessing R plus L equals J was actually no big achievement, that he hyped it up, that actually we were the only people who had even read the book before talking to him about the pitch, because that's how pitches work. You don't actually read the book being pitched. It's just him admitting, yeah, it actually wasn't this Excalibur sword in the stone moment, and it wasn't a big accomplishment. But he hypes it as part of the narrative he weaves about himself. Then, Benioff's concept of research with clips. Dear God, this is real, and it's from the 25th Hour DVD commentary. Sort of ties into the cinematography series I was making about Battle of the Bastards. That's part of a trend, his idea of research. Then, Benioff's views on story structure. These are going to be like 5 minutes of, a lot on this, of him yelling at when people say, oh, this has terrible story structure. Going back to when he was in college, this has always been a problem with him. Benioff and author insert characters, which is deeply disturbing. The time the New York Times compared Benioff to A Million Little Shards, which happened. Another one will be Benioff writing female characters and The Wedding Guest. It's this book with a female character. It's Southern Gothic, sort of like Sprout and To Kill a Mockingbird, but it was a play from the 40s. And he says he likes it so much that he named his firstborn daughter after it, Frankie. And when you actually sit down and see what is Frankie, the character in The Wedding Guest, like, I think this really tells us a lot about how he approached women in Game of Thrones. That all of this is no accident. All of these things, his story structure, research, his author insert characters, that someone should have seen this coming. No one vetted him properly. And he says crazy things. These aren't obscure interviews. They're like the DVD commentary for 25th Hour. Like, that is worth your time to watch if you can get it from a library. That it is very disturbing. So, as I work on it, this isn't taking time away from working on it, like making the slides and playing with it in these short clips. We'll be working my way up to the grand theory of what is wrong with Benioff and why did this happen, and the biography of David Benioff. So, right now, looking ahead, I'm actually going to make some preview clips for the Empire of Ash stuff. I wouldn't rule out like a 5 to 10 minute thing reacting to news, but I'm back, was working on Fire and Blood. Now you're going to get the rest of the Freeholders stuff for Empire of Ash, and then the Long Night stuff, then Benioff, then Sansa, going through like January. And thank you for sticking around, and please share your thoughts on Fire and Blood and what I've talked about here.